In reading great literature, I become 1,000 men, and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with a myriad eyes, but it is still I who see. Here, as in worship, in love, in moral action, and in knowing, I transcend myself, and am never more myself than when I do. This is Pints with Jack, Season 8, Episode 32, Narnia Month, Literary Narnia, After Hours with Dr. Jem Bloomfield. Welcome, friends, to Pints with Jack. This season we read Perelandra, but this month is Narnia Month, and today we're with Dr. Jem Bloomfield discussing two books he's written about taking a literary journey through the Narniad. Dr. Jem Bloomfield is an assistant professor of literature at the University of Nottingham and a reader in the Church of England. His research interests focus around detective fiction, the reception histories of Shakespeare and the Bible, and fantasy. He is the author of several books, but today we're going to be focusing on the two Narnian ones. Paths in the Snow, a literary journey through The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and Gold on the Horizon, a literary journey through Prince Caspian and the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Dr. Jem Bloomfield, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Not at all. Now, I've had your two books on my bedside table for the past few weeks, and I've got to say, I really love this. The cover art and the consistent feel is really, really nice. But my wife has asked me to ask you, is Jem short for James, or is there some more complex story behind your somewhat unusual first name?
Thank you. Yes, they're lovely covers, aren't they? It's something that everyone says about those books. The second one, Gold on the Horizon, is by an artist called Shirley Watson, who makes wonderful lino cuts of the countryside of the south of England, and which is indeed where my name comes from. It's not short for James, it's actually short for Jeremy.
Oh, okay.
And it was a sort of, I was christened Jeremy, it was a sort of family nickname for years, and then in my teens it just sort of stuck. When I started writing and publishing, I felt more like Jem Bloomfield than Jeremy Bloomfield, so yeah, it's the word on the front of the book.
Excellent. Well, that's one mystery solved. The next mystery is what you are drinking. I am currently enjoying a West Coast IPA from Bestie Brewing. What are you having?
It's a mug of tea. I believe it is Taylor's of Harrogate's Yorkshire tea.
Ooh, love it. Cheers.
Cheers.
So to kick things off, would you mind just telling us a little bit about your background and your history with Lewis?
Certainly. So as I mentioned, I'm from the southern counties of England. My first experience with Lewis was, as I suspect a lot of people's, was not the books, but the BBC TV version at 4 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon.
I too watched those live. I had actually watched parties before watch parties were even a thing.
So yeah, I had my Narnia doled out to me at 1.5 hour a time in the days before box sets and streaming and all sorts of stuff. It made a real impression on me. They became some of my sort of favourite stories. I became convinced for a while that Malgrim, the chief of the secret police, actually was living in the wardrobe in my own bedroom. That's how young I was.
He was kind of terrifying.
He was scared, an uncanny thing.
His mouth was very wet. I think that's the only way I can describe it. And when he sort of jumps out of the letter, giving his little monologue, terrifying.
And I got to know the Narnia novels. Funnily enough, as a youngster, two of the books that really made an impression on me by Lewis, aside from the Narnia novels, were The Experiment in Criticism and Studies in Words. I read both of those as a teenager, and actually didn't reread them for years and years, but had one of those experiences that you sometimes do when rereading a book from ages ago, where you suddenly think, oh, that's why I think that, or that's where that idea is crystallized. I thought that was just something that people thought, or, I thought I'd sort of picked up that idea somewhere. I was like, oh, right, no, a good 5 out of my 8 ideas are from these books. Intriguing.
I had the same thing when I started getting into theology. I discovered that apparently I'd just been liberally stealing from St. Augustine all this time.
I mean, that's a good source, fair play.
If you're going to steal, yeah.
The Narnia novels have always been sort of something that I pop back to. And then during lockdown, our church, like a lot of churches, had to find ways of doing things that were not in person. And sometimes that was dropping packages on people's doorsteps, and sometimes that was trying to do things over Zoom. And we had the idea of some sort of read-along. sort of dispersed book club.
Hmm.
And having to pick a book in a couple of days, I chose a book that I thought a lot of people would either have read and or got a copy of somewhere in the house. So I chose The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And we read through it, and I sort of recorded thoughts on my phone in the back bedroom and uploaded it to YouTube, as you did in those days. And then when everything opened up again, I started a reading group in the university where I work, just to read through the novels again. Called it the C.S. Lewis Reading Group, though the students insisted it's called Narnia Club, and that name has sort of stuck. Lewis ended up being part of my scholarly life, my life in the church. I would have been interested in him. It was never my intention to end up writing about Lewis. I did my doctorate on Renaissance tragedy, specifically on the Duchess of Malfi, a play I'm still very fond of. But as these things do, one's scholarly life takes unexpected turns, and I ended up here.
And here is the author of 2 books about the literary nature of the Chronicles of Narnia. So how did that step happen?
It actually came out of that reading group. I'd been interested in the idea of theology and fantasy for a few years. One of the things that we were asked to do, actually, when I started training for the role of reader in the Church of England, was to write a short essay on various literary texts, and one of the options was The Lord of the Rings, I think. And I wrote a quick thing on that, because like The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, I'm always interested in the way in which the ideas and the vision and the imagery of both Lewis and Tolkien resist sort of being boiled down to X equals Y. This book is actually about so-and-so. They seem to me to be books that so fascinatingly invite you into a different world that it's doing violence to their meaning and their intricacy to say, oh, it's actually all about X.
Yeah.
So I've been thinking about sort of theology and fantasy for a while, for a few years, and sort of reading through the books, having discussions, you just start noticing things, and I started noting them down and thought it might make a book.
Both of the books are subtitled with a literary journey through whichever book you're considering. What does it actually mean, though, to take a literary journey through a book like The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe?
I think the idea of, first of all, as a journey, it's the first book is certainly sort of chapter by chapter. So the idea is that you wander your way through The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, noticing literary allusions, but also sort of reading it literary way. And that literary bit is quite important, I think, certainly important to me. To read them as literature, to take a literary journey, is to see them with plot, narrative, character, symbolism, tone, atmosphere, all the things that we usually attribute to literature. To not always be thinking, oh, what does this actually mean? To experience it as a literary artifact, as a piece of literary art. And they are quite exploratory books. The journey is not an accident. They are novels that are often structured around journeys and quests and things. And they show you these really striking landscapes, these visions of mountains or caves or seas or hills. And I wanted to spend a bit of time in those landscapes, sort of noticing what was distinctive about them, what was striking about them. So yeah, to read them, I think, as literature, is partly to notice the fact they're made up of other texts. They are profoundly, almost pathologically allusive books. They're always quoting or joking or making little nods or allusions elsewhere. They're built out of other texts, and that's not a hit on them. You want to read The Wasteland. This is a literary culture that doesn't, the early 20th century, that does not denigrate references elsewhere. That's not to say that they are stolen or made up of other people's work, but they are texts and forms of fantasy which gather in things from centuries, from different genres, from different times and places. And to read them in a literary way, I think, is to investigate that and spend some time teasing out all the richness and texture of the works.
And in my opinion, one of the great strengths of your books is that it offers an alternative to something you mentioned earlier, the common caricature of Narnia as just thinly veiled, simplistic allegory. That once you know that Aslan is Jesus and you've got that key, you can now decode everything else, because all it is just religious propaganda, and that's about it. And both of your books show that Lewis is doing much, much more than that. And he's certainly drawing from the Bible, but he's drawing much more widely than simply sacred scripture.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm glad that comes through. even when, perhaps I shouldn't say even, but even when he's drawing on biblical narratives, he's always reshaping them. They're always echoes. As you say, it's not a simple, well, once you know that this is the story, then that's the story. In the silly examples, like in the equivalent of the Garden of Gethsemane, when Susan and Lucy walk with Aslan round this clearing, they're not there because he's asked them to watch and pray and they've fallen asleep. The reverse. They should be tucked up like good little girls and asleep. But like many child readers, they have the experience of not being able to sleep and being awake when they shouldn't be. And he says, "Oh, actually, I would like it if you spent time with me." So there are often refractions or reshapings even of the biblical material. But you're quite right. These are not simple texts. They're certainly not allegorical in the sense that Lewis uses the word in his chapter in The Allegory of Love, where an allegory is a story where you have dramatized or simply presented abstract philosophical ideas or principles in a way that could be solved by simply saying, oh, prudentia is actually prudence, or, comus is a bad example, comus is actually revelry and ribaldry, etc. He's quite definite in that chapter, if memory serves, that that kind of allegory, which he values, he sees it in medieval writing, is entirely capable of being translated completely. What's fascinating about Lewis, I think, is just how much can't be translated. How the emotional experience and the intellectual experience of the books is not reducible to a formula at the end of the experience.
The way I've always described the strength of Narnia is that he offers you a sketch and somehow your brain just keeps going with it afterwards. When I returned to Narnia in my early-ish 20s, after adoring them as a child, but not touching them since, I would often come to scenes and go, oh, that was just like half a page. I thought the battle in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I thought it was much, much longer. It's really, really short. But there's something about Lewis's writing is so evocative that he gives your brains enough hints to start with, and your imagination just starts filling it in afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, there are. I can absolutely think of scenes like the. I was convinced that The Horse and His Boy was this novel about a guy riding a horse over the desert, and that's half a page, as you say, in the actual book sequence. We think, oh yeah, that goes on for chapters and chapters. He has this very distinctive imagination, doesn't he? It's not like Tolkien, which is all. I love Tolkien, which is all sort of half tones and echoes and ruins and depth. It's got this sort of archaeological imagination. Instead, it's bright and vivid, and it's almost like heraldry or like an allegorical painting, where there are lots of busy, strange little details that, as you say, your mind just picks up and runs with.
Yeah. Well, actually, let's take a step back and talk about Lewis himself for a moment and how he was shaped by his literature. We were originally going to be doing Surprised by Joy next season, but we now bumped it to probably season 11. But my continued description of Surprised by Joy when people ask me about it is basically Lewis's life bibliography with a small conversion narrative sort of weaved all the way through it. But how was Lewis himself shaped by literature so that he in turn does the same thing in his Narnia books?
I think he's incredibly shaped by literature. He's an extraordinary reader. He appears to have had an almost eidetic memory. He appears to be able to read a work and recall almost photographically odd examples. He's certainly got a very textual memory. If you're reading a passage of Lewis, you think, oh, that strangely reminds me of this, you will often find that there are specific words or specific phrases that have been borrowed. So he's literary in the sense that he likes images and he likes atmosphere and drama, but he's got a lot of friction on the actual text. And I think he did live, and I don't mean this again as a criticism, but he lived through literature and in literature to a remarkable extent. When, as you say, when you read his writings about himself, he's often talking about books. And when he mentions the flavour of mere Christianity, he says it was something that I encountered in Spencer and Milton and Bunyan and Piers Plowman. These are such different people. But I came up against this particular flavour, this distinctive thing. And one of the remarkable things I think that the Narnia novels do is dramatise that experience of living at the crossroads of so many texts and so many books, all of which give this extraordinary flavour and all of which point in different directions, but also the same direction. There's a sort of delight in variety about these texts. And of course, stories and myths were very important to his religious life. He's a guy who all his life has been reading Norse myths and classical poetry and Idyls of the King and Spenser and everything. In the time when he's an atheist, he is still fascinated by myth. And myth for intellectuals, thinkers, readers in the late 19th century, early 20th century, is often spoken of in anti-religious ways. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so someone like J.G. Fraser writes The Golden Bough, a study in comparative mythology, and looking at myths of gods that die and rise again, or myths of heroes who are born from virgins. And as I think Ronald Hutton points out, only occasionally in some editions is it explicit, but the overall trend is, and by the way, that's why Christianity is the way it is, and there ain't nothing special about it.
Mm-hmm.
The comparative mythology tends to be, in the turn of that century, a way of saying there's nothing unique about Christianity. It's yet another fertility cult. It's yet another myth of the dying and rising God, or of the Virgin and the Consort, etc. And for Lewis, of course, that whole intellectual construct pivots creakingly on its hinges, and he comes to believe that these stories and these images and these myths are spread throughout human culture because they are refractions of the true myth.
Mm.
And one of the things that clearly excites him in lectures like his theology poetry is the idea that myth became flesh. That he talks about the difference in the circumstantial texture between the Hebrew scriptures and the Greek scriptures. And he sort of seems to enjoy both of them in their sort of literary ways, and the idea that the heroic, the symbolic, the saga-esque, the mythical became a person, and that all the great myths are in fact refractions of one actual personality.
Well, let's dive into your first book. So this is Paths in the Snow, Literary Journey Through the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Would you mind just quickly talking our listeners through the structure of the book? If someone picks up a copy, what are they going to find there?
Of course. So it goes chapter by chapter through The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, noting what seemed to me to be interesting literary details, interesting ways of reading that particular chapter in a literary way. And literary can mean a lot of things. It could mean specifically what appears to be an allusion or a reference or an echo of an earlier text. So I argue, perhaps tendentiously, that Once There Were Four Children, the names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, is perhaps a bit of a riff on Once Upon a Time There Were Four Little Rabbits. They were named Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter.
Mm-hmm.
And I riff on the fact that Lewis himself has used sort of the tale of Peter Rabbit almost as a literary touchstone at various points. That he's, when dealing with a literary theory, in a couple of places he says, and how would we apply that to Peter Rabbit? There's almost a sort of meta-literary thing there. And sometimes it's more reading as literature, so looking at Turkish delight and looking at things like rationing and post-war austerity in Britain, what Turkish delight would have meant to a child. It's not just that it's nice and it's tasty, or or not tasty if you ate the stuff. But
I was just going to say that the modern experience is usually discussed. Personally, I love it, but
yeah, proper controversy around that one. that rivals the Susan problem as the great division between the Narnian readers. But yeah, the idea that by taking, or by being offered Turkish delight, taking it and then wanting more and more Turkish delight, in a culture where rationing is still happening in the early 50s, he's implicitly taking other children's sweets. He's having more than his ration. He's deliberately trying to cut other people out of good things. So, taking elements in the book and reading them as we would read Shakespeare or Milton or, again, T.S. Eliot or Dr. Johnson or something, saying, what's the historical context here? What's the significance? And I do that all the way through the book, trying to open up avenues, trying to look at the details of that landscape, because, of course, the narrative is terribly exciting. We're heading on this quest, we're encountering these characters, we're travelling with them. And my chapter-by-chapter approach in Paths of the Snows tries to sort of slow down into a more of a ramble, where we can pause in a chapter and say, okay, what's striking about that? What's unusual? What might we not notice if we were reading this for the first time and hoping we might see Aslan, or what's going to happen next?
I just thought of a t-shirt idea. Read like Tolkien walks. Because it was often said that Lewis and some of the others would want to march ahead as quickly as they could. And Tolkien was just wandering around, looking at a little flower, probably thinking about something to do with philology.
A leaf.
Yes, or a leaf. Indeed. Now, one of the things that I've found returning to Narnia as an adult is it's driven me on to other literature. This is certainly true for Lewis's other works, where he's more explicitly telling you, he's quoting other works. It's like, nope, my very expensive education left me deficient in this. I better go find out, what the romantics are about. But even in Narnia, I've keep tripping over things, and then when I discover other literature, I think, oh, this is an echo of something that, say, happens in The Silver Chair. Sometimes Lewis is more explicit about it. When he's talking about the prince, he said he looked kind of like Hamlet. And we have a Hamlet-esque figure in there as well. But would you mind just giving us a sample of some of the literary sources and motifs that we find in that first book, Paths in the Snow?
So I mentioned the Tale of Peter Rabbit. There's sort of more children's literary stuff. When talking about Mr. Tumnus, I actually investigate The Wind of the Willows. He's a puzzling figure. He's a figure that a lot of people are very enthusiastic about. He's clearly a major image from the novel. People tend to remember him. I'm not quite sure whether that's like Proust's Madeleine, in that he's one of the first things that happens in the book. Makes a big impression on people. But he's clearly, in some sense, a classical faun or satyr, or a figure of Pan. Of course, Pan is really popular. Again, in the late 19th, early 20th century, you get people like Hector Hugh Munro, who writes as Saki, writing stories about Pan, and you get Arthur Machen, and you get Broughton, who writes an opera about Pan. Maybe I'm getting that wrong. Anyway, Pan everywhere. I mean,
appropriately enough, yes.
and of course, there is this tradition of writing about Christ as Pan. Milton includes him in the Nativity Ode. But he's really popular, and he's this symbol for a lot of writers in that period of the excitement, the attraction of paganism. He's a creature of the landscape. He's classical, so he's from before the period when Christianity is a recognizable religion. He seems to speak to the wildness and the deepness and the mystery of the landscape. And this really comes out in, I think, the best intertext is The Wind of the Willows, where at the center of the novel, the Otter's child goes missing. Ratty and Mole go to seek him, and they find this presence on an island in the middle of the river, and it is described in absolutely devotional language. They talk about awe and reverence, and something like the two animals bow down and they did worship, and it's clearly a description of Pan as curving horns and hooves, and he's taking care of the child. And I think that's a really strong intertext for Mr. Tumnus. Because Tumnus is also cloven-hoofed and horned and apparently taking care of a child, but in fact not.
He's very clearly fallen, and it actually takes Aslan to have him redeemed. A motif, a redemption of paganism that you also find appearing in the Prince Caspian.
Absolutely, yeah. You get this remarkable representation of the Pan of the English countryside. He's literally on the edge of a wood. He's the first creature she meets. But he's fallen, and he's the opening of the novel. He's not the mystic center of it the way it is in The Wind of the Willows. He is what draws you or attracts you, and then you find that there is a real king of the wood. There's something more serious and more profound going on. So there's children's literature, or there's also something like Puck of Pook's Hill, which is about some children who are they're in a field, and they are reciting a scene from Midsummer Night's Dream. And they recite the scene involving Puck 3 times, and they're by a hill called Pook's Hill, and Puck appears. He comes out of the bushes and says, "You've summoned me." "Yes." and it turns out that he is the last of the supernaturals or the fairies. Except you shouldn't call him a fairy, because one of the children uses the word fairy, and he says, "You ever heard me use that word?" He says that, I know what you mean by fairy, little buzzy things that, concerned with whether boys have been good or bad. He says that people of the woods and people of the hills don't know anything about them. He said, how would you like it if people said, "Ooh, son of Adam, daughter of Eve"? And the kids go, "Oh, we wouldn't like that at all. That's a rubbish way to speak to someone." And of course, this is all happening on the Pevensey levels. Mm-hmm. So there are clearly ideas that he's taken from that and then radically reshaped. That these children Lucy is taken aback by being called Daughter of Eve, but it reveals something profound about Lewis's mode of fantasy, that mode of fantasy that introduces us to wonders and then suggests, but isn't there something more extraordinary about being a daughter of Eve than there is about being a classical faun? Mr. Tumnus clearly thinks so. And there are sort of medieval sources as well, or perhaps I should say intertexts. I'm always really struck by that medieval carol, Adam lay abounden. Adam lay abounden, bounden a bond, 4,000 winter thought he not too long, and always for an apple that he took, as Clarkers find and written in her book. Apart from being a very interesting piece of poetry, that strikes me as being a significant work. Lewis had read everything, but we know that there is definitely a Lewisian link there, because, in fact, the edition that was on my bookshelf that includes that poem is by a scholar who, in the preface or the acknowledgement, specifically says, "Oh, and thank you to many people, including Professor Lewis, who first introduced me to the medieval lyrics." So we'd be pretty sure he's read it at some point. And he does something very characteristic with that carol, in that it has the image of the 4,000 winters, this symbol of the apparently eternal time between the fall, the taking of the apple, and the arrival of Christ. And he images this as it's like the worst thing you can think of for a 14th century person living in the countryside, like eternal winter for 4,000 years. And Lewis literalizes the metaphor. He says, okay, in my world, it is actually 4,000 winter. It is winter continually. It's not just 4,000 years that were as bad as if it were winter. No, it actually is winter. Like, literalize the metaphor. In the same way that, he looks at the messianic title of the Lion of Judah for the Messiah and goes, okay, lion, fair enough, that works. It's very Lewisian. He seems to have this taste, this interest in literalizing symbols and metaphors and allowing us to sort of enter them and have adventure stories inside them. That's one of the reasons why I think it's interesting to treat Narnia as a landscape, in that it does seem to take what are recognizable symbols and verbal metaphors of the Christian tradition and Christian theology and make them into a place that you can inhabit.
Incarnated.
Oh, you might say so, yes.
Yeah. On Pints with Jack, each season we have Jack's Bookshelf, where we look specifically at authors and books which shaped Lewis. And this season we actually looked at Kenneth Grahame specifically, and the Sehnsucht and everything else that comes along with Pan. But your book has certainly given me a bunch more names that I've now got to go track down. But let's turn to your second book, Gold on the Horizon. And in this book, you discuss not just one chronicle, but two, Prince Caspian and The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And given that your introduction to Narnia was the BBC adaptations, please tell me that you did this because you are mimicking the BBC adaptations, which also grouped together those two books into a single season.
I would love if that was true. I really would. They are, of course, the one true adaptation, except, of course, for the audio versions with Michael Hordern. We shall accept them. No, it's largely practical, and partly as a matter that if I was approaching a publisher and saying I'd like to write 6 volumes of literary commentary, how about it? They're not quite so likely to say 6. But also because I think the first Path of the Snow, the first volume of commentary, involves a certain amount of sort of explanation and justification and saying this is what a literary reading is. This is exactly. This is why we should do it. With that granted, if it is granted, can be done a bit more swiftly in the second volume. And I think, I don't know, I get the impression, I'm absolutely open to correction on this one, it strikes me that the first volume is more extravagantly eclectic than the other volumes are. It seems to, so famously as well annoyed Tolkien about it, it seems to bring together things that have no place being together. Father Christmas, an ice witch, talking beaver, a faun, deep magic from the dawn of time, etc. And that volume seems, more extravagantly embroidered and sending us in all directions. The later volumes seem to me to make somewhat deeper and more thorough engagements with a more restricted range of texts. They seem to focus in and sort of work through more thoroughly particular sources. And I think that would make sense. If he'd as I say, invented, if he created this mode of fantasy, this very eclectic form that brings together lots and lots of different forms of myth and lots of novels, and builds a story of salvation out of them. I think that's one of the really important things about that eclecticism, that it doesn't encourage you to sink down into the history of this fantastical place. It advertises its eclecticism. It's like a mosaic. It shows that the story of sacrifice, redemption, and restoration can be told via The Wind to the Willows, The Tale of Peter Rabbit, bits of classical legend, bits of medieval poetry, etc. And having delightedly and almost sort of intoxicatingly put those into a book, it seems to me that the later volumes are, as I say, dealing with a smaller number of sources and working them through in interesting ways.
Mm-hmm. That was actually going to be one of my later questions. I was curious because we've gone through the Chronicles of Narnia on here. We did one book per season, and we dug in a little bit to the literary allusions that Lewis is doing, and that was my impression as well. That with Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he just throws everything at the wall. But in subsequent ones, are very often necessitated by the plot. So with the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, you have all of the voyage stories that get pulled in, be they, Celtic monks or whatever. And obviously then when we get to The Horse and His Boy, Arabian Nights features pretty heavily as well. That's really interesting. Just before we dig into some concrete examples that you deal with in the second book, what do you make of other approaches to reading Narnia, such as Dr. Ward's Planet Narnia? And does this literary reading, does it offer an alternative or something to complement it?
Absolutely complementary, I hope. I think Dr. Ward's work is extraordinary. Planet Narnia was a book that, in fact, I had heard of but didn't read for a while, because that seems kind of schematic. That seems kind of an imposed reading. Was I ever wrong? And I read it, and that is an intoxicating book. You read it, and you're like, it sends your mind off in loads of directions, and it's a really persuasive reading. Whether there are what you might call various versions of its theory, I suppose. One that is a pre-worked out schema, one that it points to the intensely medievally stocked imagination of C.S. Lewis, possibly that he wrote a book and then went, now having done that, I could see how I could, order the sequence elsewhere. Maybe there are particular books that work for that reading better than others. But no, I think that is a tremendous work of criticism, most strongly because it makes the books seem more rich and more complex, and again makes more connections and provides more opportunities for discussion and sort of enjoyment, rather than making it seem simpler and more mechanical. And there's loads of great literary criticism on Lewis. Rowan Williams' The Lion's World, or Catherine Languish's
Spare Room,
exactly. Some of the more famous ones. And there's loads of good scholarly writing on Lewis as well. No, this is by no means either the correct way to read Lewis, nor something that supplants others.
Yes, I suppose it just gives you a different way to look at and along the works, and in the same way that some of those other lenses have provided new levels and new kinds of richness. I think this just brings yet another one to the table, and another platter to the banquet, so to speak.
Yeah, and it treats the text in a very, this sounds silly, it takes in a very textual way, but it does. If we think of text as textere, as weaving, it treats them as works which exist, the Narnia novels, it treats them as works which exist simultaneously with literature throughout history and throughout geography. It doesn't look at, in some cases it looks at the particular historical conditions he was writing in, but it doesn't look at, his biography, or it doesn't look at them as necessarily as works that are very, very connected to the intentions of the author. It treats them as literary works that are in dialogue with other works. And that, that sort of synchronic reading is only one way of looking at them.
Yes. One of my favorite podcasts is the Literary Life podcast, and somebody posted on the forum, I think just yesterday, that one of the listeners had been reading The Magician's Nephew and was saying that they were getting very Dracula vibes from Jadis, and said, do you think Lewis is talking to that book as well? And so that ended up with a huge rabbit trail. It was an awful lot of fun. But this idea of books talking to each other, I think it was a revelation to me as an adult to know that this was a thing, that books just didn't just appear in isolation, but that they were shaped by what came before in dialogue with those books and contemporary ones, and they in turn would then influence books which came after them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that's quite important to Lewis, isn't it? That he talks about essays like on reading old books, that each age only poses the questions that it's willing to find the answers to. And if you look at the big controversies in the 17th century, they seem to us to be absolutely splitting hairs, because they seem to be answering the same question, answering it the same way. And what we think of as completely opposed, political or philosophical or scientific arguments would look exactly as if we're answering the same sort of small questions in very limited ways to a different era. This sense of literary tradition, in the sense of tradition handing on, I think is very important to him. I seem to be referring to Eliot several times here, but Eliot also has this sense of tradition and the individual talent, that you are shaped by the tradition, and in doing so, you are enabled to maybe contribute to it in some sense, in some smaller or larger sense. I must say that's something that I find in his work on language. He's a book like Studies in Words, where he's really interested in the changes that words have through time and what has caused those changes and what we're doing by participating in that language. Where he takes a word like gentle and says we think it's a description of someone's physical appearance and the way they interact with other people. Their soft hands, kind hands, as we would say to the youth, kind hands and soft voices. Whereas actually originally it just means like one of us, kin, gekind, one of our lot. And then it comes to mean nobly born, of genteel kind, very parfit gentile knight. And then it comes to mean upholding a certain set of moral and social values, the 19th century gentleman. And then it gets used sort of, satirically. And he says, this is a classic example, what he calls the moralizing of status words, where words that mean a particular social position come to be used either as a positive or negative. If you're someone who's frank and open and free, you are described by a word meaning a member of the Frankish nation who probably has a horse and is a free citizen, as opposed to someone who's a villain who is literally tied to the ground. Not literally tied to the ground. Sorry, he is literally legally tied to a portion of land because he's a peasant.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he uses that in his fiction. So Susan is Susan the Gentle. Now, she can be, no doubt at her school that she's travelling to in the novel, she's advised to be gentle, but it means that she can live her Narnian self, if you like, in our world. She can be Queen Susan the Gentle, just as Peter could be Peter the Magnificent, meaning of high deeds, and Edmund can be Edmund the Just, meaning Edmund the Justified. That sense of sort of literary tradition, I think, can also be seen in his approach to linguistic tradition, that by using words, particularly in fictional poetry, you're not simply either coining them yourself, nor are you just participating in a flat system that's just set up for this moment. You are borrowing from other people, you are incurring obligations, you are entering into a system of judgment and value and all these things, even if you don't know it, perhaps especially if you don't know it.
Well, before we wrap up, let's dip into the sequel, Gold on the Horizon. Let's take a little dip into the Narnian seas, and what are some of the literary sources and motifs that we find in the next two Narnian books?
Yeah, loads of fun ones. There's one you've already mentioned, the fact that we have a Prince Caspian who is standing on the battlements being told something very important about the fact that his uncle apparently killed his father, and he is of a race known as the Telmarines, which, if you take the reins off, looks like Hamlet backwards. And then he has various... in many ways, this is a sort of Hamlet with a eucatastrophe. It's a Hamlet where this young man faces the past of himself and his nation and and his royal line, etc. The restoration of the king, in fact, the return of the king, we might call it. There are odd and little gnarly bits, like the finding of the golden chess piece absolutely fascinates me. When they get back to Cair Paravel in Prince Caspian, and they don't know it's Cair Paravel, and they treat it like archaeologists, and they say, this must have been where the people had the banquets, and this must have been where there was music on the dais. and Susan weeps over the chess piece and says, "I'm sorry, it reminds me of my horse who I loved so much, and playing chess with the good giants." And Edmund or Peter says, "Well, we better sort this out. We better sort this problem out because it's going to be night soon." And it may be coincidence, but I'm strongly suspecting it's not coincidence. All those tropes appear in your elegiac poetry by the Anglo-Saxon poets. So things like the wanderer and the ruin and the seafarer, particularly the wanderer with its lament, where is the feasting in the hall? Where is the mailed warrior? Where is the steed? Where is the glee harp, etc.? Oh, they are all gone, disappeared as if they never were under the darkness of night. And you can almost line up those tropes in that chapter, in that discussion where the children are sitting. I mean, Susan sort of becomes an Anglo-Saxon bard sitting in the ruins of this castle, which is something that Anglo-Saxon bards love to do. They love to talk about the ruins of the past and how everything is gone. And there's a really strong sense of specifically the wanderer, but generally the tropes of Anglo-Saxon verse, even down to the fact that she cries over her horse, like the bard does, and night is about to come on. There's perhaps one more I should mention. No, there's loads more I should mention, but I shall take one example. Again from Caspian, that bit at the end where they romp across the landscape, and all sorts of magical and extraordinary occurrences happen, wondrous things happen, when Aslan and the girls and Bacchus and Silenus and the Maenad sort of romp across Narnia. And there is some extraordinary, and again, Lewis's very, very precise literary imagination. There are some extraordinary episodes like Aslan heals the woman that turns out to be the old nurse, and says, "Bring water to her," and it tastes, it looks like red wine or something, it tastes like beef tea. And he has to sort of knock her house down in order to do this. And there's moments where he goes to a school and there are these ghastly little boys being taught mathematics. They're being rotten to their teacher, and he says to her, "Come with me." And she says, "No, please, I want to, but I can't." And he says, "Come with me." And the children turn into pigs and run away. There's this man flogging a boy with a stick, and the stick turns into a flowering branch and attaches itself to the man. Almost all of these can be read both in terms of the Gospels. So we have water that's drawn from a well and turns about to something else when it's drunk, like the wedding of Cana, and we have the Gadarene swine, where these little devils that are plaguing this learned young woman are turned into swine and they run away. There's even Jesus as the flowering stock sprung from the root of Jesse. Freedom from oppression and violence comes in the form of a stick that flowers. But they're also legible through Ovid's Metamorphoses. So there is the numerous accounts of nymphs becoming trees as they're being chased by Pan often, or Apollo. There's the moment when Circe is surrounded by Ulysses' men and they're all turned into pigs by her magic. And there are these moments where Lewis seems to me to be doing an extraordinary thing, retelling a story which at the same time is Ovid's Metamorphoses and the Gospels. Where he seems to be picking, again, I don't know whether deliberately or whether he just has this incredibly precise textual imagination, where he retells stories that refract both the liberation brought by Christ and the mysterious transformations of Ovid's Metamorphoses. And in doing that, I don't think he's just bringing the Bible and Ovid together, though I think he's doing that as well. He's sort of making himself into a medieval clerk. There's loads of medieval writers do that, Henryson and the writers of the 14th century Ovid Moralizé, who translate Ovid into medieval French and then, or French as they called it then, and then they annotate on how it can be a Christian allegory. It speaks to what you were saying about tradition. Lewis, even in writing a fantasy chapter in which Ovid and the Gospels happen in the same landscape, doesn't seem to be thinking he's doing anything new. He seems to be taking his place in a line of medieval clerks who have Christianized Ovid.
Yes, tweaking the stories. It's like, I think it would work better like this. And you have that in spades in Till We Have Faces, where it's like, I'm going to retell the story of Cupid and Psyche, but I'm going to fix it, because there are some things here I've never liked. And so by and large takes the same story, but then makes some important tweaks. And it's very often turning things on its head. You mentioned Lucy and Susan. They are both, the apostles, and they are the women at the tomb, but there's some really important differences. This season, we read Perelandra, and there's just a section in I think it's the penultimate chapter, or maybe 3 chapters from the end, where Ransom is being nurtured by the planet. And it's almost an inverse of the myth where Tantalus? Yes, it's Tantalus, where he tries to reach up to get the fruit and it goes out of the way. He goes down to try and drink the water and then it sinks. But it's all now completely inverted, where the planet is coming to feed him. It describes the branches actually coming down to feed him. He's surrounded by water that he can drink. It just seems to be a very common Lewisian turn. It's like, I'm going to take these sources, but I'm going to turn some things on their heads. And suddenly it's quite transformed.
That's so interesting, yeah. And it fits very strongly with this idea that he's got this creative imagination that stocked all these ideas, and he sees them all in the light of the Logos. You know, he sees them all as things which sort of tend towards revealing truth, but need to be informed by each other and need to be sort of enriched by their source, so to speak.
It's not simple allegory, but it is the power of symbol. There was a letter that he sent to one editor that was asking for more apologetics works from him later in his life. And he says, not really doing that so much more. I want to catch the reader unaware through symbol and story. And I think this is what he's doing.
Absolutely.
Now, as we wrap up, do you have hopes of giving similar treatments to the remaining chronicles? If you're starting to group them together, that's maybe, 2, maybe 3 more books? Or maybe perhaps some of Lewis's other fiction, like the Ransom trilogy.
I'm certainly working on the next Narnia volume. In fact, it's due out this Christmas.
Excellent.
I'm towards the end of a manuscript where I deal with Silverchair and Horse and His Boy, which is enormous fun. One doesn't want to be sort of schematic about it, but
they're both quest stories.
Yeah. It's as you say, quest. It's sort of what if book 1 of the Fairy Queen happened, only it happened in the cave from Plato's Myth of the Cave. He has these great sort of, what if the story of the Prince and the Pauper was told? But again, in the Prince and the Pauper, there are these references to sort of salaaming and oriental courtesy as a metaphor in medieval England. What if it actually was happening in the Arabian Nights? What would go on there? Like, tremendous fun writing those, and I'm planning to write on the last 2 books as well. I'd like to tackle his other fiction. I think I shall have to keep this series just to the Narnia work, because they're so dense and they're so elusive, but they are so self-contained. It is a fantasy world, and as someone said to me at an event a while ago, he's an extraordinary guy in that he elaborates this world that we want to inhabit and we want to explore. And loads of people. You look online, people are saying you could have a Narnian tea party where, you can have a Narnia-themed wedding or whatever. But at the end of the series, he renounces it. He gives up Narnia and says, no, there is something greater. It's this, everything I've written is a straw, etc. It's extraordinary that he clearly has a sense, the fiction has a sense at least, that it couldn't be this elaborate and this complex and this engrossing if it wasn't actually animated by something outside itself, something that's greater. The coherence of it, and then that it does feel like a renunciation in many ways. Many people don't like that last book for exactly that reason. They want to go back in Narnia and hear more stories. We want more Narnian fanfic. We want more infills and retcons and stuff. I'm always working on Dorothy Sayers, but I'm also working on Dorothy Sayers because I find her endlessly fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. I was listening to a podcast just the other day, and they were talking about. It was kind of like the history of oppression of women, as they were talking about how you could get a woman sent to a sanatorium. I kept thinking of her essay, "Are Women Human?" and that's all I could hear ringing through my ears as they were talking about it.
Yeah, she's a wonderful novelist and deeply, deeply infused by sort of biblical and scriptural learning as well. I think her detective novels they have a lot of common with Lewis, actually, in their elusive habit. Now, she is, as you mentioned, with reference to another writer, indeed Lewis himself sometimes, much more on the surface. You're missing the references when Harriet and Peter start quoting poets and stuff. But she does have that elusive habit, that habit of shading and expanding and sort of making what she's writing about greater by the awareness of what's outside it.
Wonderful. Well, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Been a delightful conversation. That's one of the things about when you get chatting about Narnia, isn't it? The theme runs away with one. But no, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a great lark.
Not at all. As always, it's nice having an interviewer who has a proper accent.
Wow, shots fired.
I am technically now an American. I got citizenship like 3 weeks ago. So,
oh, congratulations.
Thank you.
Land of the free, mate. Very good.
Well, you say land of the free. All I'm going to say is that the parking at the government office where I had to go for my interview charged me $20 for the privilege. So it might be the land of the free, but they still charge. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people go to find out more about you and your work?
Thank you. Well, wherever good or indeed bad books are sold. I'm also on Twitter and on Instagram. I'm at Jem Bloomfield on both. And I do bits of sort of occasional literary writing and journalism and stuff. But yeah, that's where I'm to be found, or often to be found on a Sunday in the parish church in Beeston, if anyone's moving through the East Midlands.
Well, I'll also make sure that we got links to your lectures that you gave on the Chronicles of Narnia chapter by chapter that are on your parish's YouTube channel. I hear the call for final drinks, so thanks to our guest again, Dr. Jem Bloomfield. Thanks to our intern Julia, our sound engineers Taylor and Sarah, and all of our patron supporters, particularly our top tier supporters. Dan, Jody, Robert, Mark, Mary Margaret, Rowdy, Angela, David, Peter, Kate, James, John, Sarah, Rebecca, Megan, Brian, Joanna, Kelly, Stephen, Gary, Paul, Kay, Becca, Shane, Thomas, Amanda, Joelle, Erica, Matt, James, Bud 1 and 2, Edgar, Aldo, Kevin, Mark, and of course all of you for listening. And please join us again next time when we'll continue going further up
and further in.
Cheers!
Cheers.